He had survived Stalingrad. He had walked through the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, past the bodies of men he had known since childhood. He had eaten bark. He had drunk snow. He had watched his commanding officer weep, not from grief, but from frostbite, because the man's tear ducts had frozen solid. He had crossed half of North Africa under a merciless sun, and he had fought with everything left in him until there was nothing left to fight with. And then, on a warm Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1943, somewhere in the Tunisian desert, Wehrmacht Corporal Hans Werner Pfluger raised his hands above his head, walked toward a line of American soldiers, and surrendered. He was 23 years old. He weighed less than 130 pounds. His boots had holes in them. His last meal had been 2 days ago. The American soldiers took his rifle, searched him, gave him water. And then one of them, a young private from Mississippi with a sunburned nose, reached into a canvas bag, pulled out a small paper cup, and handed it to Hans Werner without saying a single word. Hans Werner looked down at it. He didn't know what it was at first. It was white. It was cold. He pressed his thumb against it and felt the frost against his skin like a whisper from another world. It was ice cream. He stood there in the middle of a war, in the middle of a desert, holding a cup of ice cream. And for a moment, Hans Werner Pfluger forgot everything. He forgot the war. He forgot the dead. He forgot the Führer and the flags and the speeches and the years of violence that had carved him hollow. He just stood there with his thumb going numb and his eyes going wet and ate ice cream in the Tunisian desert like a child at a birthday party. That single moment, that absurd, impossible, quietly beautiful moment, is a window into one of the most extraordinary and least told stories of the entire Second World War. A story that unfolded not on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over London, but in the heartland of America itself. In dusty small towns in Kansas and Georgia and Arizona, in quiet prison camps surrounded by wire, where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers encountered something that shook them more deeply than any bomb ever had. They encountered America. And if this kind of story, the ones they never put in the history textbooks, is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, then stay with me. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. Because we go looking for exactly these moments, the ones hiding just beneath the surface of the history everyone thinks they know. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened inside those camps, you have to understand what these men had been told, not just about the war, about America itself. From the moment Adolf Hitler's propaganda machine reached full operational power in the mid-1930s, ordinary Germans were fed a specific and carefully constructed portrait of the United States. America, they were told, was a nation of contradictions and weakness. It was a mongrel country, a place without culture, without discipline, without the iron will required to fight a real war. Its people were soft, its soldiers were untested, its society was built on shallow pleasures, jazz music, Hollywood movies, cheap consumer goods, rather than the deep spiritual bedrock of the German Volk. Joseph Goebbels was particularly enthusiastic about this narrative. He understood, better than almost anyone in history, that the most effective lies are the ones that contain just enough truth to feel real. And he was right that America was a place of consumer culture. He was right that Americans loved their music and their movies and their soda pop. What he got catastrophically wrong was his conclusion that this made them weak. What he missed, what the entire Nazi high command seemed constitutionally incapable of grasping, was that a nation wealthy enough to produce abundance in peacetime was a nation with the industrial and logistical capacity to absolutely bury you in wartime. But in 1940, in 1941, in the early dark months of 1942, that lesson had not yet been delivered. And so the German soldier who found himself facing American troops did so with a head full of Goebbels. He had been told Americans couldn't fight. He had been told they would fold. He had been told that the soft, pleasure-loving, Coca-Cola drinking Americans would crumble the moment they faced real German steel. Some of them believed it right up until the moment the Americans took them prisoner. And then the real education began. The numbers alone are staggering when you look at them clearly. By the end of the Second World War, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. Let that number settle for a moment. 425,000. That is more people than currently live in the city of Minneapolis, more than the entire population of New Orleans. Nearly 500,000 young German men, most of them between the ages of 18 and 30, shipped across the Atlantic and deposited into the American heartland. They came in waves. The first significant arrivals came after the North Africa campaign collapsed in May of 1943, the same campaign that had caught Hans Werner Pfluger in the desert with his ice cream. When the Africa Corps finally surrendered, the Allies found themselves holding roughly 275,000 German and Italian prisoners. The British and Canadians took their share, the Americans took the rest. And suddenly, the American army was confronted with a logistical challenge of almost comic proportions. Where do you put 150,000 German soldiers? The answer, it turned out, was everywhere. The War Department had been quietly preparing for this possibility since 1942, and what they had designed was a system of camps scattered across the continental United States, deliberately placed far from both coasts to prevent any possibility of escape back to Germany or any practical communication with enemy submarines. The camps went up in places like Mexia, Texas, Florence, Arizona, Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Camp Forest, Camp Crossville, Camp Hearn, Camp Trinidad. The names read like a geography lesson in American provincialism, and that was, to some extent, deliberate. These were places as far from Europe, physically, culturally, spiritually, as you could get without leaving the planet. The Geneva Convention of 1929 governed the treatment of prisoners of war, and the United States took its obligations under that treaty with remarkable seriousness. Prisoners were to be housed in conditions comparable to those of the detaining power's own troops. They were to receive adequate food, medical care, opportunities for work, and basic human dignity. The Americans, to the shock of almost every German soldier who arrived on their shores, not only met those standards, in many cases they exceeded them dramatically. Private First Class Carl Ludemann arrived at Camp Aliceville in Alabama in the summer of 1943. He was 20 years old, a former baker's apprentice from Hamburg and Hamburg, and had been fighting in North Africa for 11 months. He had expected a prison, barbed wire, guard towers, cold concrete, maybe beatings. He had heard stories, rumors that moved through the ranks like viruses about what happened to prisoners. He had steeled himself for the worst. And then he got something altogether different.
The camp was clean. The barracks were wooden structures with real beds, not just bunks, but actual mattresses. There were shower facilities. A medical clinic staffed with American doctors who, as far as Carl could tell, genuinely intended to keep him alive. There was a camp canteen where prisoners could purchase cigarettes, soap, and small personal items. There was a library. A library. Carl stood in front of the shelves and ran his fingers over the spines of the books and felt something shift inside his chest that he couldn't quite name. Then came the food. The American military rationing system, even under wartime conditions, was producing meals of a quality that would have seemed like fantasy to a German soldier who had spent any time on the Eastern Front. The prisoners at Camp Aliceville received 3 meals a day. They received meat, real meat, not the gray scraps that had occasionally appeared in the bottom of a Wehrmacht field kitchen pot. They received bread, vegetables, coffee, desserts. Carl wrote a letter home to his mother. All prisoner mail was censored and monitored, but most of it was allowed through, and he used 3 sentences to describe the food. His mother, reading the letter in a Hamburg apartment that had recently lost half its ceiling to an RAF bombing raid, reportedly cried for an hour. Not from relief that her son was safe, though there was that too. She cried because her son, a prisoner of war in enemy hands, was eating better than she was. That contrast, that almost cruel irony, was not lost on the Germans themselves. It was not lost on anyone. But the food was only the beginning. The ice cream was only the beginning. To understand the full psychological earthquake that the American prisoner of war experience inflicted on its German occupants, you have to understand the specific and bizarre culture of abundance that they stumbled into. America in 1943 and 1944 was a country at war, yes. Rationing was in effect. There were shortages of rubber and gasoline and certain metals. Women were working in factories. Men were dying on distant beaches. The country was mobilized and focused and driving itself at full speed toward the destruction of the Axis powers. All of that was true. And yet, even under wartime rationing, the American standard of living was so far above anything these young German men had ever experienced that it registered not as a difference of degree, but as a difference of kind. It was like the difference between a campfire and the sun. Coca-Cola. This is worth pausing on because the Coca-Cola story inside the prisoner of war camps is one of the stranger and more revealing threads in this entire tapestry. The Coca-Cola Company had made a remarkable and historically significant declaration early in the war that every American service member, wherever they were in the world, should be able to purchase a bottle of Coke for a nickel. The company built 64 bottling plants overseas. It engineered portable dispensers. It made the Coca-Cola bottle, that distinctive, curved, impossible-to-mistake silhouette, into a symbol of American identity as recognizable as the stars and stripes. And because the Geneva Convention required that prisoner of war canteens be stocked with the same goods available to American soldiers, Coca-Cola flowed into the camps. The first time many German prisoners encountered it, they had no idea what to do with it. Sergeant Wilhelm Brandt of the 15th Panzer Division later recalled in a memoir written decades after the war the afternoon he first held a bottle of Coca-Cola. He had been in Camp Hearn, Texas, for approximately 2 weeks. An American guard had handed it to him without ceremony, as casually as you might hand someone a glass of water. Wilhelm turned the bottle over in his hands, read the label, though he understood little English, opened it, heard the hiss of carbonation, that small domestic explosion of released gas, put it to his lips. He described the sensation as being kissed by chemistry, sweet and sharp and cold, and utterly unlike anything the German beverage industry had ever produced. He drank the entire bottle in one long pull. Then he sat down on the edge of his bunk and stared at the bottle for a very long time. I thought, he wrote, about all the things they had told us about America, that it was decadent, that it was weak, that its people were without discipline or strength or purpose. And then I thought about the fact that these same people had, in the middle of a global war, organized the production and distribution of this cold, perfect, unnecessary drink to a prison camp in the middle of Texas. And I understood for the first time that we had been lied to about something far more important than I had realized. They had been lied to. That was the central discovery, made again and again in camp after camp by soldier after soldier across the American interior. And the lies had not been small, easily dismissible lies. They had been fundamental, load-bearing lies, lies upon which an entire world view had been constructed.
The Nazi regime had told its soldiers that America was a broken society, that its racial mixture made it inherently weak and chaotic, that capitalism had corrupted its people into a state of selfish individualism incompatible with the collective sacrifice required to win a war, that its military was disciplined and amateur, that its industrial output had been exaggerated by Jewish-controlled media. All of it, every single piece of it, demonstrably, visibly, undeniably wrong. The evidence was everywhere. It was in the quality of the food. It was in the maintenance of the barracks. It was in the efficiency of the camp administration, which processed hundreds of thousands of men with a logistical precision that would have made a German staff officer weep with professional admiration. It was in the roads outside the camp fence, stretching off into the distance, past diners and gas stations and farms that seemed to German eyes almost hallucinatorily prosperous. It was in the American guards themselves, ordinary men, not especially ferocious, not especially ideological, just doing a job, who maintained basic human decency without being ordered to, as though it came naturally. We had been told they were animals, one prisoner recalled years later, but they were just people, ordinary people, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Not frightening in the sense of threatening, frightening in the sense of demolishing something. When you have built your entire identity on a certain understanding of the world, and then the world proves that understanding catastrophically wrong, there's a specific quality of internal collapse that follows. It is quieter than a battlefield explosion, but in its own way, it is more destructive. The work program made it worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be required to work, provided the work was not directly connected to the war effort and provided it was fairly compensated. The American sector embraced this provision with enormous enthusiasm, and for reasons that were not purely humanitarian. By 1943, the American agricultural sector was in crisis. Millions of young men had been pulled out of the workforce and shipped overseas. Crops were going unharvested. Farms were struggling. The labor shortage was genuinely threatening food production. German prisoners, it turned out, were an extraordinary solution to this problem. They were put to work across the country, harvesting cotton in Texas and Mississippi, picking citrus fruit in Florida, processing sugar beets in Nebraska, canning vegetables in Tennessee, working in lumber mills and railroad maintenance and construction projects. They were paid, not much, but something, in the form of canteen credits, and they were sent out each morning in groups under minimal guard into the American countryside, where they worked alongside American civilian workers and frequently American farmers and their families. This was where the real education happened, not in the camps, but on the farms. Because on the farms, these men saw the America that didn't exist in Goebbels' propaganda. They saw the actual machinery of American agricultural production, the tractors, the irrigation systems, the organized efficiency of large-scale farming that made the average German farm look like something from a previous century. They saw the farmhouses, not palaces, but comfortable, solid, well-maintained homes with electricity and indoor plumbing and refrigerators. Refrigerators! In the country, on a working farm. Private Heinz Feldman, a 19-year-old from rural Bavaria who had grown up on a farm himself, spent 3 months working on a cotton farm in Georgia. In a letter to his father, carefully reviewed by camp censors, who allowed it through because it contained no military information, he wrote, "Papa, the family I am working for has a machine that keeps food cold inside the house. It is the size of a wardrobe. The farmer's wife uses it to keep meat for an entire week without it going bad. Their children drink cold milk from glass bottles every morning. I have been trying to explain to myself how a country that has all of this could possibly lose a war, and I cannot do it." His father, a man who had voted for the National Socialists in 1932 because he believed they would restore Germany's strength and dignity, reportedly kept that letter hidden inside a Bible for the rest of his life. The ice cream deserves its own chapter, really, because the ice cream was not just ice cream. Nothing in this story is just what it appears to be on the surface. Ice cream in 1940s Germany was a rare and occasional luxury. It existed, yes. You could find it at certain cafes in the summer months, but it was not a staple. It was not something ordinary people consumed regularly. It was a treat, associated with specific occasions: a child's birthday, a summer festival, a Sunday afternoon before the war changed everything. In America, ice cream was different. It was everywhere. It was cheap. It was something you had for dessert on a Tuesday. It was something the Army could produce in bulk and distribute to its camps as a routine matter of morale and nutrition. Ice cream plants operated throughout the war. The U.S. Navy built a floating ice cream barge in the Pacific, an actual ship designed primarily to make and distribute ice cream to sailors at a cost of approximately $1 million. $1 million 1940s dollars spent on ice cream for the troops, because American military planners understood that morale was a resource as real and as important as ammunition. When German prisoners encountered ice cream in American camps, the reaction was, almost universally, the same: disbelief, followed by something that looked a lot like grief. Not grief for themselves. They weren't sad to be eating ice cream. The grief was for the story they had been living inside, for the narrative that had been built around them and into them, brick by brick, from the time they were children in the Hitler Youth. The ice cream was the moment when the narrative broke. "We were eating ice cream," a former prisoner named Georg Henkel said in an interview conducted in the 1970s when he was in his 50s and living in West Germany and could speak about these things without the fear that had silenced so many for so long. "We were eating ice cream. We were prisoners. We had lost, and we were eating ice cream. And I remember thinking, what was this all for? What was any of it for? What did we fight for? What did my friends die for? So that the people who took us prisoner could give us ice cream?" He paused for a long time after saying that. The interviewer let the silence sit. "I think," Georg Henkel finally said, "that ice cream is the most anti-war argument I have ever encountered." Not every German prisoner went through this transformation willingly, not by a long measure. The Nazi hierarchy within the camps was real, persistent, and in some cases genuinely dangerous. One of the most important and least discussed aspects of the POW camp experience was the internal politics that immediately emerged among the prisoners themselves. The German military in 1943 and 1944 was not a monolithic block of identical ideological soldiers. It was a complex mixture of true believers, reluctant conscripts, opportunists, moral cowards, and a small but significant number of genuine resistors and dissenters. And all these different kinds of men were now locked up in the same camps. The hardcore Nazis, particularly the SS men and the most zealous Wehrmacht officers, were a minority, but they were loud, organized, and sometimes violent minority. They had spent years in an institution that rewarded brutality and punished dissent, and they brought those habits with them behind the wire. In camp after camp, internal tribunals were set up by prisoner leadership to police behavior and enforce ideological conformity. Men who were seen to be too friendly with Americans, too comfortable in their captivity, too willing to accept the evidence of their own eyes about the prosperity of the country that had captured them, were labeled traitors, defeatists, enemies of the Reich. The consequences could be severe. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma in November of 1943, Private Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by fellow prisoners. Kunze had been seen talking freely with American camp administrators, and there were accusations, some credible, some probably fabricated, that he had been providing information to camp authorities. His killers beat him with their fists and with stools and with whatever came to hand in the camp recreation room, while other prisoners stood and watched or looked away. 5 men were tried for the murder. 5 men were convicted. 4 of them were eventually hanged at Fort Leventhon, becoming the only German soldiers executed on American soil during the Second World War. The killing of Johannes Kunze was not the only act of prisoner-on-prisoner violence, but it was the most extreme, and it illuminated something important. The camps were not just places of captivity, they were ideological battlegrounds. Every prisoner who ate his ice cream and felt the crack in his worldview, every man who said out loud what he privately thought, that Germany couldn't win, that it was wrong, that they had been lied to, was a threat to the men who needed the ideology to stay intact. Because if the ideology crumbled, so did the identity, and some men would rather kill. The American military was not naive about this internal dynamic. They were watching it carefully from the beginning, and they were planning something far more ambitious than simply feeding prisoners and putting them to work on farms. They were planning to use the camps as a school. In 1944, the War Department established what was officially called the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, though it became known informally, and to the German prisoners who eventually passed through it, almost mythologically, simply as the Re-Education Program. Its official goal was to identify German prisoners who were not committed Nazis, to educate them in democratic principles and American values, and to prepare them to serve as the seeds of a new democratic Germany after the war. The program operated out of a special facility at Fort Eustis in Virginia, and later expanded to other locations. It had a remarkable faculty. Many of its instructors were German Jewish intellectuals and academics who had fled Germany in the 1930s and found refuge in the United States. Men who had been professors at German universities before being stripped of their positions and their citizenship by the Nuremberg laws. Men who had lost everything to the regime whose soldiers they were now tasked with unmaking. The re-education program was controversial from the beginning. Some American military figures thought it was a waste of resources. Some thought it was too soft. Some of the German instructors thought it was misguided, or too optimistic, or too gentle in its confrontation of what Germany had actually done. And some of the German prisoners who went through it came out the other side genuinely changed, broken open and rebuilt, carrying something they hadn't had before. Not just a new political opinion, but a new capacity for self-examination, a new willingness to ask what they had been part of and why, and what that meant. The outside world was changing too, and the change was catastrophic. As 1944 turned to 1945, the war news that filtered into the camps, through newspapers, through official announcements, through the increasingly grim faces of the German prisoners who understood enough English to follow the broadcasts from the camp radio, painted a picture of absolute, total, and irreversible German defeat. The Normandy landings, Paris liberated, Brussels liberated, the failure of the Ardennes offensive, which many prisoners had initially greeted with a surge of desperate hope, the last flare of a faith they couldn't quite extinguish. Then the Rhine crossed, Berlin encircled, and finally, on a day that registered in the camps as a kind of collective suspension of breath, the announcement that Adolf Hitler was dead, that the 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and was over. The reactions to this news were as varied and complicated as the men themselves. Some prisoners wept. Some cheered, quietly, carefully, with one eye on the men around them who might not take the cheering well. Some went silent in a way that was not grief exactly, but something more total. the silence of a man whose entire framework for understanding the world has just been removed from beneath his feet. Some didn't believe it, not all at once. Denial is a powerful and resilient thing, and there were men in those camps who had been so thoroughly inside the ideology that the ideology had become indistinguishable from reality. For these men, the news of Hitler's death was not the end. It was a lie, or it was a tragedy, or it was a temporary setback from which Germany would eventually recover, because Germany was eternal, and the Reich was eternal, and everything they had been promised would eventually arrive. These men were the hardest cases, and in some respects, they were the saddest. Not because they were evil, though some of them had done evil things, but because they were lost, because they had given everything, youth, conscience, humanity, to a cause that had consumed those offerings without ceremony and left them with nothing but a mythology collapsing in real time around their ears. There was a man in the bunk next to mine, a former prisoner recalled, who cried every night for 3 weeks after they told us the war was over. Not because he was sad Germany had lost, because he was sad his whole life had been a lie. There is a difference. The question of what to do with all of these men, nearly 500,000 of them, now technically held as labor prisoners rather than prisoners of war, since Germany had ceased to exist as a functioning state, was a logistical and moral puzzle of enormous proportions. Repatriation began slowly in 1945 and accelerated through 1946. Men were shipped back to Europe in the same vessels that had brought them west. But where they went from there was not always clear. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Cities were ruins. Families were scattered. Some men returned to find their homes had been bombed flat and their families had become refugees in what used to be their own country. Some didn't want to go back. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Men who had built small lives in the camps, had learned English, had made friends with American guards, had somehow in the strange, suspended animation of captivity found something they hadn't found in Germany. A sense of their own worth that didn't depend on military rank or racial ideology or national destiny. Just a quiet, plain sense that they were human beings, and that was enough. The outside world was changing too, and the change was catastrophic. As 1944 turned to 1945, the war news that filtered into the camps, through newspapers, through official announcements, through the increasingly grim faces of the German prisoners who understood enough English to follow the broadcasts from the camp radio, painted a picture of absolute, total, and irreversible German defeat. The Normandy landings, Paris liberated, Brussels liberated. The failure of the Ardennes offensive, which many prisoners had initially greeted with a surge of desperate hope, the last flare of a faith they couldn't quite extinguish. Then the Rhine crossed, Berlin encircled, and finally, on a day that registered in the camps as a kind of collective suspension of breath, the announcement that Adolf Hitler was dead, that the 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and was over. The reactions to this news were as varied and complicated as the men themselves. Some prisoners wept. Some cheered, quietly, carefully, with one eye on the men around them who might not take the cheering well. Some went silent in a way that was not grief exactly, but something more total. The silence of a man whose entire framework for understanding the world has just been removed from beneath his feet. Some didn't believe it. Not all at once. Denial is a powerful and resilient thing, and there were men in those camps who had been so thoroughly inside the ideology that the ideology had become indistinguishable from reality. For these men, the news of Hitler's death was not the end. It was a lie, or it was a tragedy, or it was a temporary setback from which Germany would eventually recover, because Germany was eternal, and the Reich was eternal, and everything they had been promised would eventually arrive. These men were the hardest cases, and in some respects, they were the saddest. Not because they were evil, though some of them had done evil things, but because they were lost, because they had given everything, youth, conscience, humanity to a cause that had consumed those offerings without ceremony and left them with nothing but a mythology collapsing in real time around their ears. There is a woman named Elsa Bremer, a pseudonym she chose herself years after these events, who tells a story about her father that is, in its quiet way, one of the most complete summaries of this entire history that I have ever encountered. Her father was a former German soldier, a man who had served in France and North Africa and spent 2 years in a camp in Georgia. He never talked about the war, not once in his entire childhood. He had come back to Germany in 1946, met her mother, built a modest life as a carpenter in a small town in Bavaria, and never, as far as she knew, told anyone that he had spent 2 years in the United States.
She found out after he died, going through his papers. There was a small cardboard box in the back of a closet, inside a larger box of tools. In the small box were a handful of items, a few photographs, some letters, a dried flower that she couldn't identify, and a receipt, yellowed and soft with age, barely legible, from a camp canteen in Georgia. The receipt was for 2 Coca-Colas and 1 serving of ice cream. The date on it was July 4th, 1944, American Independence Day. Her father had kept a canteen receipt from a prison camp for 50 years, had kept it through the move back to Germany, through the rebuilding of his life, through the births of his children and grandchildren, through the entire second half of the 20th century, had kept it and never thrown it away and never told anyone about it. I think, Elsa Bremer said, that it was the day he stopped believing in the lie. I think he bought those Coca-Colas and that ice cream on the 4th of July, and someone probably told him what the holiday was, and he understood something he had been refusing to understand for years. And he kept the receipt because you keep the evidence of the moments that change you, even when you can't talk about them, maybe especially then. The prisoner of war camp program in America was not perfect, let that be said clearly, because history that erases its own complications is not history, it's mythology, and we have seen what mythology costs. There were camps where conditions were harsher than others. There were American guards who were cruel, who used their authority to humiliate and occasionally abuse the men in their charge. There were failures of the re-education program that were real and documented. Some of the men who went through it came out no different, or only superficially changed, wearing a new ideological costume over an old ideological core. And there is a deeper, more uncomfortable critique that has been made by historians in recent decades, that the relative kindness extended to German prisoners stands in sharp and troubling contrast to how America treated its own black citizens during the same period. Black soldiers who fought for the United States in Europe and the Pacific returned home to segregated buses and lunch counters and voting booths. In some of the southern camps, German prisoners, the soldiers of a nation that had built a racial state, could sit at lunch counters where black American soldiers could not. This was not incidental. This was American apartheid operating in full view of the irony, and the people in charge knew it, and most of them did nothing about it. The German prisoners noticed this too, and their reactions varied. Some were smugly comfortable with it. It confirmed the racial hierarchies they had been taught, now apparently endorsed by the Americans themselves. Some were genuinely confused. A few were disturbed by it in ways they couldn't quite articulate. A very small number said, out loud, that what they were seeing was wrong, that it looked familiar, that they had seen this before and knew where it led. History does not always offer clean lessons. Sometimes it offers a tangle of truths that cut you from multiple directions simultaneously, and the honest response is to feel them all without rushing toward the comfort of a single, simple conclusion. And yet, the central story, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola, the abundance, the human decency that outlasted ideology is real.
It happened, and its effects were real. When West Germany emerged from the rubble of the Third Reich and began the painful, necessary process of building a democratic society, it did not do so in a vacuum. It did so with hundreds of thousands of men who had spent 1 to 3 years in the American heartland. Men who had seen, with their own eyes, what a functioning democracy actually looked like, what prosperity built on law and openness and the free movement of goods and ideas actually produced, what it felt like to be treated as a human being by the enemy who had defeated you. This is hard to quantify. Historians debate its importance, but the men themselves, the ones who lived through it and left records, were often unambiguous about what it meant. Friedrich Bayer, who spent 2 years at a camp in Arizona and returned to Germany to eventually become a local politician in the 1960s, said in a speech late in his career that the foundation of his belief in democracy had been laid not in a classroom, not in a book, but in a prison camp in the desert, where a man he had been taught to hate as a racial inferior had once stopped to help him when he tripped and fell in the yard, had helped him up without being asked, had dusted off his arm and said, "You okay, buddy?" in the casual American way, and walked on without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. That is where I understood democracy, Friedrich Bayer said. Not from an argument, from a hand. Think about what it means to change a man's mind, really change it, not on the surface, but at the level where his deepest assumptions about reality are formed. You cannot do it with force. Force produces compliance, not conversion. You cannot do it with argument alone. Argument can be dismissed, countered, ignored. You can only do it by making a man live inside a reality that contradicts his beliefs for long enough that the contradiction becomes impossible to deny. You have to let the ice cream do the work. You have to let the Coca-Cola speak for itself. You have to let the farmer who helps a prisoner fix his equipment on a Tuesday afternoon in Georgia be more eloquent than any speech Goebbels ever wrote. America did not set out to wage an ideological war against the German soldiers in its custody. It set out to warehouse them, use their labor, keep them fed and healthy per treaty obligations, and send them home when the war was over. The re-education program was a relatively late and imperfect addition to something that was already happening organically. What happened organically was this: America was itself. And being itself, America dismantled the lies that had been built around these men without trying to, without knowing it, simply by existing in the form it actually existed in. The ice cream was not a propaganda strategy. The Coca-Cola was not a weapon. The hand that helped Friedrich Bayer up from the ground was not an ideological instrument. They were just things that happened in a country where those things were ordinary. And ordinary America, it turned out, was more radical and more transformative than anyone, American or German, had anticipated.
It is 1985, a small town in Bavaria. A man in his mid-60s is sitting in his kitchen on a Sunday morning, and his granddaughter, she is 9 years old, she has his eyes, is eating ice cream at the table across from him. Vanilla, with a small pool of chocolate syrup beginning to melt into it in the Sunday morning heat. The man watches her eat for a moment. She doesn't look up. He gets up from his chair and opens the refrigerator and takes out a bottle of Coca-Cola. He has always kept Coca-Cola in the house for as long as his children can remember, which they have always found slightly eccentric for a man of his generation and his tastes. He pours himself a glass, sits back down, watches his granddaughter's spoon navigate the ice cream. She looks up at him and says, "Opa, do you want some?" He smiles at her, a long, complicated smile that she is too young to read the full depth of. "I already had mine," he says. She shrugs and goes back to her ice cream. He sits there in the Sunday morning kitchen, holding his Coca-Cola, watching his granddaughter eat ice cream in a country that is, at this particular moment in history, at peace. He is not a dramatic man. He has not written a memoir. He will not make any speeches. He will go to his grave without having told more than 2 or 3 people what he is thinking about right now. He is thinking about a desert in Tunisia, a paper cup, a thumb gone numb with cold. He is thinking about how the world almost went another way entirely, how close it came, how many men it cost to bring it to this kitchen, this Sunday morning, this granddaughter and her ice cream. He is thinking that some truths are too large for words, so they live instead in small things, a receipt in a cardboard box, a hand that helps you up from the ground, a bottle of something sweet and cold and unnecessary handed to you by someone who had every reason not to. He sits in his kitchen and holds his Coca-Cola, and outside the window the Bavarian morning is green and quiet, and the church bells are starting somewhere in the distance, and his granddaughter finishes her ice cream and asks if she can have more, and he says, "Yes, of course, go ahead, take as much as you want." The history that changes the world is rarely the history of the speeches and the strategies and the official documents. It is often the history of the paper cup, the cold bottle, the hand that reaches down without ceremony. We are drawn to the grand gestures, the turning point battles, the decisive moments, and those matter. But what this story tells us, what these hundreds of thousands of young men who crossed the Atlantic in chains and came back across it changed to tell us, is that human beings are most fundamentally altered not by force or argument, but by experience, by being made to live inside a different reality long enough for it to become undeniable. The American prisoner of war program was not perfect. America was not perfect. This story is not a simple celebration, but inside its complexity is something real and worth holding on to. The idea that decency, practiced consistently and without fanfare, is more powerful than propaganda. That the ordinary, ice cream on a Tuesday, a hand up from the ground, a cold drink on a hot afternoon, can do what armies cannot. That small human moments accumulate over time into something that changes the direction of history. 425,000 men came through those camps. Most of them went home. Most of them rebuilt their lives in silence. Most of them never gave interviews or wrote books or stood on stages to describe what had happened to them. They just lived in Bavaria and Hamburg and the Rhineland, and eventually in a unified Germany that looks from the vantage point of the present like something close to the thing those dusty camp administrators in Georgia and Texas and Nebraska were fumbling toward. Not perfect, but trying. Not perfect, but democratic. Not perfect, but at peace. And somewhere in the foundations of that peace, invisible and uncelebrated, and probably unjustifiable as a line item in any budget proposal, is the memory of ice cream, of Coca-Cola, of paper cups, and small, cold astonishments in the middle of a world on fire. That is a story worth knowing. That is a story worth telling. If it moved you, if it made you see something in a different light or feel something you weren't expecting to feel when you sat down today, consider leaving a like. It takes 1 second, and it means more than you might think. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones that hide underneath the history everyone thinks they already know, the ones that put a human face on the machinery of the past, then subscribe to this channel. We'll be here, digging in the places most people walk past, finding the paper cups and the cardboard boxes and the receipts that tell the whole story. Because the whole story is always worth knowing.